She was forced to marry an Amish man she'd never met. What came next changed her forever. The church bell tolled at sundown, and a young widow was led to the altar with a stranger in black. No choice, no love, just duty and chains she could not break. Out on his silent farm, the nights were cold, the fields unforgiving, and the man she now called husband barely spoke a word. But in the shadows of that plain house, she found secrets he had buried, letters, grief, and a truth that bound them tighter than vows ever could. Then came the fire in the barn, the betrayal of kin, the iron grip of the railroad threatening to take all they had. Every step drew her deeper into a life she never wanted, but perhaps was destined to find. Was this marriage her prison, or the only chance she had to discover faith, love, and a home stronger than steel? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Isabel stood at the window of Richard Lapp's farmhouse, watching darkness settle over the autumn landscape. The evening air had grown cool, seeping through the glass pane. Behind her, dishes clinked quietly as Richard cleared their mostly silent supper. Her fingers traced the simple gold band on her left hand. Just this morning, she had awakened in her own bed in her father's house. Now, everything had changed with a speed that left her dizzy. Uncle Silas's stern face and urgent knocking seemed like a bad dream, but the ring was real enough. Would thee like more coffee? Richard's soft voice broke through her thoughts. Isabel turned from the window. No, thank you. The formal thee and thy of his plain speech still sounded foreign to her ears. She studied him as he moved about the kitchen, tall and broad-shouldered. In his dark clothes, his beard neatly trimmed, his movements deliberate and careful. The kitchen was spotless but stark. No curtains softened the windows, no decorative plates lined the shelves. Only the necessities of daily life occupied the space: iron cookware, plain crockery, a well-worn Bible on the shelf. "I'll show thee to thy room," Richard said, lighting a lamp. The flame cast dancing shadows on the walls as he led her up the narrow staircase. Isabel's legs felt heavy as she climbed. Each step took her further from the life she'd known, further from her father's cozy study with its books and maps, further from the colorful quilts her mother had sewn, further from everything familiar and dear. At the top of the stairs, Richard opened a door. "This was my sister Anna's room," he said quietly. "I hope thee will be comfortable here." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a plain wooden chest, and a small wash basin. A single window looked out over the fields, now dark beneath the rising moon. A hand-stitched quilt in subtle blues and grays covered the bed, the only touch of artistry in the austere space. "Your sister's room?" Isabel asked, curiosity briefly overcoming her reserve. It was the first personal detail Richard had shared. A shadow crossed his face. "She passed 2 winters ago. Fever." His words were simple, but Isabel heard the grief beneath them. "I'm sorry," she said softly, recognizing the same loss that still ached in her own heart when she thought of her father. Richard nodded once, then gestured to a door across the hall. "My room is there, should thee need anything." He hesitated, then added, "I know this is not what thee would have chosen." "I will not. Thee need not fear. I mean only to offer thee shelter and protection." Isabel felt tears prick at her eyes. Though whether from gratitude for his consideration or grief for all she'd lost, she couldn't say. "Thank you," she managed. "Good night, then." Richard withdrew, his footsteps creaking on the stairs as he descended. Alone in the room, Isabel sank onto the bed. The events of the day crashed over her in waves. Uncle Silas's urgent insistence that only this marriage could save their land. The whispers and stares in town as she'd walked to the meeting house, in her best dress, not even a proper wedding dress. The solemn ceremony over so quickly she'd hardly had time to think. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall around her shoulders. In the morning light, she'd have to face this new life properly, learn the rhythms of an Amish household, navigate her place in this strange world of plain ways and quiet faith. Tonight, she allowed herself to weep quietly for all she'd left behind. The quilt was soft beneath her fingers as she smoothed it. Someone, Richard's sister Anna, perhaps, had stitched it with care and skill. Like Isabel herself, it was now part of this house, serving a purpose its maker hadn't intended. Through the open window came the low sounds of night, the rustle of wind in the cornfields, the distant call of a whippoorwill, the soft lowing of cattle in the barn, unfamiliar sounds, yet somehow soothing in their steady rhythm. Isabel wiped her eyes and began to unpack her small carpet bag, each movement deliberate and careful, like laying the first stones of a new foundation. From downstairs came the quiet sound of Richard moving about, banking the fire for the night. Despite his reserved manner, she sensed no cruelty in him. He seemed as bound by duty and circumstance as she was, making the best of what fate and her uncle's scheming had dealt them both. The first pale light of dawn crept through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the plain wooden table where Isabel sat. The unfamiliar quiet of the farmhouse pressed in around her, broken only by the soft scraping of Richard's spoon against the cooking pot as he stirred breakfast porridge. The morning milking needs doing by 6 o'clock, Richard said, his voice calm and measured as he placed a bowl before her. Then the chickens want feeding, and the garden needs tending before the day grows to warm. Isabel's fingers tightened around her spoon. The metal felt cold against her skin. "I am not your servant," she said, lifting her chin. "I may be here by circumstance, but I won't be ordered about like hired help." Richard paused, his broad shoulders stiffening slightly beneath his black vest. "I meant no offense. These are simply the tasks that need doing each day." He spoke the words carefully, as if measuring each one. "I thought thee might want to know the ways of the farm." "Well, I don't," Isabel replied, though the sharpness in her voice felt childish even to her own ears. She pushed her porridge around the bowl, barely tasting it. Without another word, Richard finished his own breakfast and rose from the table. The screen door creaked as he stepped out into the misty morning, heading toward the barn where the horses waited. Isabel waited until his footsteps faded before standing. The kitchen felt suffocating in its plainness. No curtains, no decorative plates, not even a tablecloth to soften the hard edges of the wooden furniture. She moved through the downstairs rooms like a ghost, trailing her fingers along the unadorned walls. The stairs to the loft creaked under her feet as she climbed. Dust motes danced in the thin streams of morning light filtering through the small window. Several pieces of furniture had been stored here: an old rocking chair, a chest of drawers missing one handle, and a cedar chest pushed against the far wall that the chest's hinges protested as Isabel lifted the lid. The sweet smell of cedar rose up, along with the musty scent of stored linens. She shifted aside several folded quilts, and her hand brushed against something solid. A wooden box, small, enough to hold in both palms. Inside, she found letters, the paper yellowed and soft with age. The first one began, "Dearest Brother Richard." Isabel's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it further, reading words written in a delicate feminine hand. "I know how much you care for Sarah, and how hard it is to choose between love and faith, but I need you here, brother. The treatments drain me, and Father cannot manage alone." Isabel's breath caught. She read through letter after letter, each one signed "Your loving sister, Anna." They told a story she had never expected of Richard's love for an English girl named Sarah, of his struggle between that love and his Amish faith, of his sister's illness and his final choice to remain for her sake. The last letter was dated. "Just 2 months before Anna's death, you have given up so much for my sake, dear brother. I pray that someday you will find joy again and someone to share your gentle heart." Sunlight had shifted across the floor by the time Isabel carefully replaced the letters in their box. Her earlier anger felt hollow now, replaced by a complicated mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. She returned everything to its place in the cedar chest, disturbing the dust as little as possible. That evening, Richard returned from the fields to find supper waiting. A simple meal of bread and stew Isabel had managed to prepare from what she found in the pantry. They ate in their usual silence, but Isabel found herself studying him with new eyes, seeing past his reserved exterior to glimpse the man who had loved so deeply, lost so much, and still carried on. Richard noticed her gaze, but didn't question it. "These should rest well tonight," he said as he cleared the dishes. "Tomorrow brings more work." Seppa nodded, her throat tight with words she couldn't speak. How could she admit to reading such private thoughts? Yet the knowledge sat heavy in her chest that this quiet man, who seemed so rigid, so wrapped in tradition, had once stood where she stood now, torn between duty and desire. In her bed that night, sleep eluded her. The moonlight painted silver patterns on the wall as she stared up at the ceiling, thinking of Anna's words. Her resentment at being forced into this marriage still simmered. But alongside it now grew something else, a reluctant curiosity about the man fate had bound her to, and the depths that lay beneath his silent exterior. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as Isabel followed Richard toward the chicken coop. Her city boots, still stiff and unsuited for farm work, caught on every uneven patch of ground. The hens clucked and scattered as they approached, pecking at the dirt with sharp, decisive movements. "Here," Richard said, holding out a woven basket. "Move slow and steady. Check under each hen, gentle-like." Isabel reached tentatively beneath the first chicken, who squawked in protest. The warm egg slipped from her grasp, cracking against the coop floor. She flushed, expecting ridicule, but Richard simply nodded. "It takes practice," he said, demonstrating with calm, sure movements. "Let your hands slide soft, like this." By the time they finished gathering eggs, Isabel's basket held 3 unbroken ones, while Richard's was full. Her arms ached, but a small spark of satisfaction warmed her chest at even this modest success. They moved to the woodpile next, where split logs waited to be broken down into kindling. Richard positioned a log upright on the chopping block and handed Isabel the hatchet. "Mind your grip," he cautioned. "Let the weight of the blade do the work." Isabel's first swing went wild, barely grazing the wood. The second buried the blade at an awkward angle. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she struggled to free it. Richard stepped forward, adjusting her hands on the handle without comment. "Like this," he said, guiding her motion. Straight down, following the grain. The rhythmic work slowly became easier, though Isabel's attempts were still clumsy compared to Richard's precise strikes. The morning passed in a blur of small tasks, each one revealing how much she had to learn about this new life. The sound of hoofbeats around midday drew their attention. Sheriff Fletcher rode up the dusty lane, his badge glinting in the sun. He dismounted with a grunt, pulling a telegram from his vest pocket. "Morning, Richard," he said, nodding. "Mrs. Lapp, got something here you'll want to see." Isabel wiped her hands on her apron, taking the paper with trepidation. Her eyes widened as she read the typed message. "Can't be right," she said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "The railroad claims they have contracts for our land, signed by Uncle Silas." The sheriff shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "That's what they're saying. Railroad agent's been filing papers with the county court. But how could he? The farm wasn't his to sell." Isabel's hands trembled with anger. "Sheriff, there must be something you can do." "Not my jurisdiction, ma'am. These things got to go through proper channels, lawyers and such." He touched the brim of his hat. "Best talk to the county judge when court's in session next week." Richard took the telegram, reading it with grave attention while the sheriff mounted up and rode away. Isabel paced the yard, her earlier satisfaction shattered. "Did you know about this?" she demanded, turning on Richard. "Is that why you agreed to marry me, because you knew the land might be taken anyway?" Richard folded the telegram carefully, his expression thoughtful. "No," he said simply. "I knew nothing of these claims." "Then what are we going to do?" Isabel's voice cracked. "I gave up everything to save this land, and now some railroad man with false papers thinks he can just take it. We must fight together, not against one another." Richard's quiet words stopped her pacing. "The truth will stand if we stand with it." The evening meal was a silent affair. Isabel could barely eat, her mind spinning with possibilities, all of them ending in loss. Richard maintained his usual calm, but she noticed the tightness around his eyes, the careful way he studied the telegram between bites of stew. As dusk settled over the farm, Isabel stepped out onto the porch. The air had grown cooler, carrying the sweet scent of hay from the fields. Crickets chirped in the growing darkness, an evening chorus that somehow made her feel both more alone and less lonely at the same time. She wrapped her arms around herself, gazing out at the land that had been her father's pride. Somewhere in the shadows lay the boundaries that the railroad now threatened, lines drawn on paper that could destroy everything she had sacrificed to protect. Yet Richard's words echoed in her mind. "We must fight together." The steady certainty in his voice had touched something inside her, a tiny spark of hope she hadn't expected to find. Perhaps there was strength in this reluctant partnership after all, strength enough to face whatever came next. The screen door creaked behind her, and Richard's solid presence joined her on the porch. Silent, but somehow reassuring as they stood together in the gathering night. Isabel's muscles protested as she gripped the plow handles, her arms trembling with effort. The early morning sun beat down on her back, while Richard walked beside her, patient and steady. The horse pulled forward, and the metal blade cut through dark soil, leaving neat furrows in its wake. "Keep the line straight," Richard guided, his voice calm. "Let your body lean into the turn." She adjusted her stance, remembering how he had demonstrated earlier. The plow shifted more smoothly, though her hands still threatened to slip on the worn wooden handles. Sweat trickled down her neck, but she pressed on, determined to master this essential task. When they paused to rest the horse, Richard handed her a dipper of cool well water. "You're learning quick," he said, the simple praise warming her more than she expected. They moved to the barn next, where a pile of broken harnesses waited for repair. Richard showed her how to thread the heavy leather through brass buckles, how to test each stitch for strength. The leather was stiff and unyielding under her fingers, and the thick needle pricked her hands more than once. "The trick is finding the weak spots before they break completely," Richard explained, running his fingers along a worn strap. "A good mend now saves trouble later." By evening, Isabel's hands were raw and blistered from the day's work. She sat at the kitchen table, trying to wrap strips of clean cloth around her palms without wincing. Richard appeared with a tin of salve, setting it beside her without comment. The quiet stretched between them, broken only by the tick of the mantel clock. Isabel thought of the letters hidden in the cedar chest upstairs, of the questions that had burned in her mind since finding them. "Richard," she began hesitantly, "would you tell me about Anna, your sister?" He stilled, hands flat on the table. For a long moment, Isabel thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice soft with memory. "She was younger than me by 6 years, bright as sunshine even when she was sick." He paused, choosing his words carefully. The fever took her when she was 16. The letters, Isabel admitted, I found them in the chest. I'm sorry for prying. Richard nodded slowly, unsurprised. Anna wanted me to be happy. There was someone then, not Amish, who offered a different life. His eyes grew distant. But leaving would have broken Anna's heart. She believed in our ways, in keeping faith with family. Isabel saw the grief etched in the lines around his eyes, the weight of loss carried quietly for so long. She touched his hand briefly, a gesture of understanding that needed no words. The next morning, they hitched the wagon for a trip into town. They needed seed for the winter wheat, and Richard had a list of other supplies. Isabel sat straight-backed beside him on the wooden seat, aware of the stares that followed their progress down the main street. Whispers drifted from the boardwalk. That's her, the English widow, married an Amish man. Strange match, ain't it? Ain't it? Isabel lifted her chin, though her cheeks burned. Richard guided the horse to the mercantile, helping her down from the wagon with steady hands. Inside the store, the shopkeeper's wife watched them with poorly concealed curiosity. When Isabel approached the counter to purchase thread, the woman's smile turned sharp. "Suppose you'll be wanting plain colors now," she said, her tone suggesting Isabel wouldn't know proper Amish ways. "Nothing fancy like you're wearing." Before Isabel could respond, Richard stepped forward. "My wife knows her own mind," he said quietly but firmly. "She needs no instruction in what to choose." The shopkeeper's wife flushed and hurried to wrap Isabel's purchase. Isabel felt something warm unfurl in her chest at Richard's defense, not loud or angry, but certain in its protection of her dignity. They loaded their supplies as the sun began to sink, casting long shadows across the dusty street. The ride home was peaceful, the wagon wheels creaking a steady rhythm. Isabel watched the familiar landmarks past the old oak at the crossroads, the split trail fence marking their property line, and realized they felt different now. Less like markers of her imprisonment and more like signposts guiding her home. As they crested the last hill, the farmhouse came into view, its windows catching the golden evening light. Richard helped her down from the wagon, his hand lingering briefly on her arm. Isabel met his eyes and saw something there that matched the tentative warmth growing in her own heart. Not love, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of trust. They worked together to unload the wagon, moving in a comfortable silence that felt nothing like the strained quiet of their first days. Each small task completed side by side seemed to weave another thread in the delicate bond forming between them, as gentle and promising as the first stars appearing in the dusk above. The autumn wind rattled the window panes as Isabel sat at the kitchen table, turning the envelope in her hands. The stage had brought it that morning, her uncle's familiar slanted writing stark against the cream paper. Richard stood by the stove, his presence steady as she broke the seal in the warm lamplight. Isabel's voice trembled as she read aloud, "Dear Isabel, I write to inform you that I have secured the future of our family holdings through an arrangement with the railroad company. The water rights have been sold at a fair price, ensuring their legitimate claim to the Hollister farm." She stopped, her fingers clenching the paper until it crumpled. "He sold us out," she whispered, then louder, anger breaking through. "He betrayed us, my own uncle." Richard remained still, but his jaw tightened. "Read the rest," he said, quietly. Isabel forced herself to continue, each word bitter as gall. This decision was not made lightly, but progress cannot be stopped. The railroad's offer was most generous. "I trust you will see the wisdom in accepting these changes gracefully." The letter dropped from her shaking hands. "Wisdom," she spat. "He calls this wisdom. Selling away our water rights behind our backs." She pushed back from the table, pacing the wooden floor. The lamp flame wavered with her movement, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Richard picked up the fallen letter, studying it carefully. His voice, when it came, held the calm surety of deep roots. "We will not yield." Isabel turned to him, caught between despair and desperate hope. "How can we fight this?" "The railroad has money. Lawyers, we have truth," Richard interrupted gently, "and proof of ownership. We will gather our evidence and contest their claim." He moved to the shelf where they kept important papers, pulling out their deed and marriage certificate. "These are our weapons." Isabel watched him arrange the documents with methodical care. The rage still burned in her chest, but something else grew alongside it. Trust in Richard's unwavering resolve. He had proven himself steady through every storm so far. The next morning dawned clear and cold. They hitched the wagon early, the horse's breath steaming in the crisp air. The drive to the county office took most of the morning, the wagon wheels crunching through fallen leaves. Isabel sat close to Richard on the wooden seat, drawing strength from his quiet presence. The county office was a square brick building with tall windows and worn wooden steps. Inside, the clerk peered at them over wire-rimmed spectacles as Richard presented their papers. "Deeds proper," the clerk muttered, examining the documents. "Marriage certificate, too." But these railroad claims, he shuffled through more papers. On his desk, "They're making a lot of noise about water rights, saying they bought them legal-like." "From someone who had no right to sell," Isabel said firmly, stepping forward. "My uncle betrayed our trust and exceeded his authority." The clerk nodded slowly. "Well, that's for the court to decide. There's a session coming up next week. Judge Thompson will hear the case then." He handed their papers back carefully. "Best keep these safe until then." Outside, the afternoon sun had warmed the air. As Richard helped Isabel into the wagon, she caught his hand. "I don't regret standing beside you today," she said softly, surprising herself with the truth of it. Richard's face remained unreadable, but his eyes met hers with a warmth that made her heart skip. He nodded once, then climbed up beside her. The wagon creaked into motion. Heading home through the golden autumn light, Isabel watched the familiar landscape roll past, feeling the weight of the papers tucked safely in her pocket. Her uncle's betrayal still stung, but it had revealed something valuable, the strength she and Richard possessed when they stood together. The railroad might have money and influence, but they had something perhaps more powerful, a shared determination. To protect what was rightfully theirs, the horses plodded steadily homeward, their hooves marking time with the beating of her heart. Each step carried them closer to the battle ahead, but Isabel found she was no longer afraid. Whatever came next, she would face it with Richard at her side. Their partnership forged stronger by each challenge they weathered together. Autumn painted the countryside in amber and rust as Isabel and Richard worked side by side, preparing for winter. The potato harvest demanded long hours bent over the earth, their backs aching as they filled basket after basket with dusty tubers. Isabel's hands, once soft, grew calloused from the wooden handle of the pitchfork they used to turn the soil. "The cellar needs these stored proper," Richard explained, showing her how to layer the potatoes in sand. "They'll keep through the cold months this way." Isabel nodded, learning each new task with determination. The rhythm of farm work, though exhausting, brought its own kind of peace. She watched Richard stack firewood against the barn wall, his movements sure and steady. The pile grew higher each day, a bulwark against the coming cold in the kitchen. Isabel spent hours preserving the garden's bounty. She packed jars with pickled vegetables and sweet preserves, following Richard's mother's recipes found penciled in an old notebook. The cellar shelves slowly filled with gleaming glass jars, each one a promise of sustenance through the lean winter ahead. But the constant work took its toll. One evening, as Isabel stirred a pot of apple butter, the kitchen suddenly tilted sideways. Her hands trembled as she gripped the counter, heat flooding her face. "Richard," she called weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. The wooden spoon clattered to the floor as her knees buckled. Richard caught her before she fell, his strong arms steady around her waist. "You're burning up," he said, pressing a work-roughened hand to her forehead. The world spun as he helped her to the bedroom. "Ush." Isabel felt him ease her onto the bed, her body shaking with chills despite the fever's heat. Through the haze, she was aware of Richard moving around the room, stoking the fire. Gathering clean linens, he returned with a basin of cool water and clean cloths. With gentle hands, he bathed her face and neck, the cool moisture bringing brief relief. When she shivered, he tucked blankets around her shoulders. "Try to drink," he murmured, holding a cup of broth to her lips. The warm liquid slid down her throat, carrying the taste of herbs she recognized from their garden. Time blurred as the fever held her in its grip. Sometimes she dreamed of her father, of the farm as it was in her childhood. Other times she floated in darkness, anchored only by Richard's presence beside her. In lucid moments, she heard him praying softly in Pennsylvania Dutch, the unfamiliar words flowing like water. Though she couldn't understand them, the deep devotion in his voice touched something in her heart. "Lord," he whispered in English, "grant her healing. Keep her safe in your hands." His fingers wrapped around hers, warm and protective. The night seemed endless, but Richard never left her side. He changed the cool cloths, helped her sip water, and spoke quiet words of comfort when fever dreams made her restless. As dawn approached, the fever finally broke. Isabel drifted into natural sleep, her breathing easy at last. When she opened her eyes to morning light, she found Richard slumped in a chair beside the bed, his hands still resting protectively over hers. His face in sleep looked younger, the usual stern lines softened. Something shifted in Isabel's heart at the sight. This man, whom she had once seen as cold and distant, had tended her through the night with such gentle care. The assumptions she had built around him crumbled like autumn leaves. She must have moved, for Richard stirred and opened his eyes. Seeing her awake, he straightened, concern clear in his face. "How do you feel?" "Better," Isabel said softly. "The fever's gone." He nodded, relief evident in the set of his shoulders. Rising stiffly from the chair, he went to fetch her a cup of water when he returned. Isabel struggled to find words to express her gratitude. "Thank you," she managed at last. The simple phrase, "feeling inadequate," for taking care of me. Richard paused in adjusting her pillows. His eyes met hers, deep with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "A man cares for what God entrusts to him," he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Isabel felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with fever. This new understanding between them felt delicate, as a spider's web, but just as real. Richard helped her sit up, his hands careful and sure. Though neither spoke further, something had changed. The distance that had separated them since their hasty marriage had narrowed, replaced by a tentative closeness that promised more. Autumn settled deeper into the valley as weeks passed. The morning frost lingered longer on the grass, and wisps of wood smoke curled from the farmhouse chimney. Isabel found herself falling into the rhythm of farm life, her movements growing more confident with each passing day in the barn. She learned the proper measure of feed for each animal. The horses now nickered softly at her approach, and even the suspicious old milk cow had begun to accept her presence during morning milking. Her hands, though still bearing the memory of fever, worked steadily at each task. The kitchen became her domain as well. The yeasty smell of fresh bread filled the house twice weekly, and she took quiet pride in the neat rows of darned socks and mended shirts in Richard's drawer. What had once felt like obligation now carried the weight of caring. Richard's characteristic silence, which had once seemed like a wall between them, now felt different. She began to read the small signs of his approval, a slight nod when she managed a perfect loaf, the way he paused to watch her gentle handling of a nervous colt, the extra wood he stacked by the stove on cold mornings. His quietness felt less like indifference and more like the steady foundation of their shared life. One crisp morning, they hitched the wagon for a supply run into town. The leather reins creaked in Richard's hands as they rolled past harvested fields. The sheriff's office lay just past the general store, and Amos Fletcher stepped out onto the boardwalk as they approached. "Folks," he called, his weathered face grave. "Might want to hear this." They drew the wagon to a stop. Isabel's heart tightened as the sheriff explained, "Railroads got their fancy lawyers pressing hard on your claim. They're aiming to fast-track. The hearing before winter sets in." Richard's jaw tightened, but he simply nodded. Isabel gripped the wagon seat, her knuckles white. The ride home was quiet, both of them lost in thought as the sun sank toward the horizon. That evening, as Richard stoked the fire, Isabel set down her mending. "What if," she said slowly, "there's something in the old papers? Something to prove. Our right to the land." Richard considered this, then climbed to the loft. He returned, carrying Anna's trunk, his movements careful with the precious cargo. Together, they lifted out bundles of yellowed papers. Spreading them on the kitchen table, the lamplight cast a warm glow as they began to read. There were deeds, tax receipts, and letters, dozens of them, carefully preserved in Anna's neat hand. Isabel handled each document gently, aware of their importance. She could almost feel Anna's presence, as if the young woman's spirit watched over their search. With approval. "Here," Richard said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. He handed Isabel a stack of correspondence between Anna and their father, dating back 15 years. The letters detailed the original land purchase, complete with witness signatures and official stamps. "This proves the continuous ownership," Isabel breathed, hope rising in her chest. "And look, there's mention of the water rights being specifically included in the sale." They worked late into the night, organizing the papers into a clear record of their claim. The lamp burned low, shadows dancing on the walls as they pieced together their defense. Isabel felt the weight of Anna's legacy in every carefully preserved document. As midnight approached, exhaustion and emotion finally loosened Isabel's tongue. "Richard," she said softly, not meeting his eyes, "I need to tell you something." She twisted her hands in her apron. "I've feared all along that I've been nothing but a burden to you. This forced marriage, my ignorance of farm work, even this fight with the railroad." Richard set down the papers he was holding. In the lamplight, his face was gentle. "Isabel," he said, his voice low and certain, "you have been my strength." The simple words filled the kitchen, settling into Isabel's heart like warmth from the banked fire. She looked up to find Richard, watching her, his eyes holding something that made her breath catch, not just duty or tolerance, but genuine appreciation. Joy bloomed quietly in her chest, as subtle and real as dawn breaking over the fields. She reached across the table and touched his hand, rough with work and familiar now. He turned his palm up to meet hers, and they sat in comfortable silence. Surrounded by Anna's papers and the promise of tomorrow, the night deepened around the farmhouse, stars wheeling overhead. Inside, the lamp burned steady, illuminating too. People who had moved from strangers to allies, from reluctant partners to something deeper. Together, they would face whatever challenges the railroad might bring, strengthened by Anna's legacy and their growing trust in each other. Dawn had barely touched the horizon when Isabel and Richard hitched their wagon. The morning air held a sharp chill, and their breath formed small clouds in the darkness. Isabel tucked a woolen blanket around their legs as Richard clicked to the horses. Starting their long journey to the county seat, the rhythmic creak of wagon wheels filled the silence as they traveled. Fields stretched out on either side, stubble frosted silver in the growing light. Isabel held the precious bundle of documents close, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect against the morning damp. Her stomach churned with nervous anticipation. Richard drove steadily, his broad shoulders set against the cold. Every few miles, he would glance at Isabel, checking her comfort without words. The sun climbed higher as they covered the distance, warming the air slightly. They passed other wagons and riders, all headed to town for the hearing. The county courthouse rose before them as they entered the town proper, a solid brick building with white columns and high windows. Isabel's hands trembled as Richard helped her down from the wagon. Together, they climbed the worn stone steps, joining the crowd of townspeople filing into the building. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Isabel felt the weight of curious stares as she and Richard found seats near the front. Some folks pointed and murmured about the strange pair, the English widow and her Amish husband. Richard sat tall beside her, seemingly unaffected by the attention, though. Isabel noticed the tightness around his mouth when their case was called. Isabel's heart thundered in her chest. She gripped the deed tightly as they approached the judge's bench. The railroad's lawyer stood opposite them, sleek and confident in his city suit. Judge Harrison, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, looked down at them over his spectacles. "Present. Your evidence," he instructed, his voice carrying through the hushed chamber. Richard stepped forward, his quiet voice steady as he began laying out their case. Isabel marveled at his calm demeanor as he explained the history of the land, producing document after document from Anna's collection. The letters and receipts painted a clear picture of rightful ownership, including the disputed water rights. "These papers," Richard said, holding up Anna's correspondence, "show the original terms of purchase, witnessed and recorded 15 years ago." The judge examined each document carefully, while the railroad's lawyer argued about progress and development. Isabel watched the judge's face, trying to read his expression. The morning stretched on, tension building in her shoulders as both sides presented their arguments. Finally, Judge Harrison cleared his throat. "This case requires careful consideration of all evidence presented. I will postpone my ruling until I have reviewed these documents thoroughly." He fixed the railroad lawyer with a stern look. "No action is to be taken regarding the property until my final decision." Relief flooded through Isabel, though she knew this was only a temporary reprieve. As they left the courthouse, townspeople cleared a path, still whispering. Richard's hand found the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd to their waiting wagon. The journey home felt lighter somehow. The afternoon sun warmed their faces, and the immediate threat had eased. Isabel watched Richard's profile as he drove, seeing him with new eyes. This man who had stood beside her, who had presented their case with quiet dignity, was no longer the stranger she'd been forced to marry. "Richard," she said softly, gathering her courage, "I need you to know something." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You're not a stranger to me anymore. These past months, I've come to see who you truly are." Richard turned to look at her, surprise flickering across his features. Then, slowly, his lips curved into a small but genuine smile, a rare gift that transformed his entire face. He didn't speak, but his eyes held warmth that made Isabel's heart skip. They arrived home as evening approached. The familiar sight of their farmhouse, smoke curling from the chimney where they'd banked the morning fire, filled Isabel with unexpected contentment. They worked together to unhitch the horses and tend to the evening chores, moving in comfortable synchronization. Supper that night felt different from any meal they'd shared before. The kitchen glowed with lamplight as they ate the simple fare of bread, stew, and apple pie. Their spirits were lighter, hope mixing with something deeper that neither dared name yet. As Isabel cleared the dishes, she found herself humming an Old hymn her father used to sing. The tune filled the kitchen as she worked. And she realized with sudden clarity that this place had become more than just shelter. Somewhere between the daily tasks and shared struggles, it had become home. She looked over at Richard, who sat mending a harness by the fire. His strong hands worked steadily at the leather, his face peaceful in the lamplight. Yes, she thought. This was home now, not just the house or the land, but the life they were building together. A week after their court appearance, the crisp autumn evening settled peacefully over the farm. Isabel stood at the kitchen window, washing the last dish from supper while watching Richard's lantern bob through the darkness as he made his final check on the animals. The barn's familiar silhouette loomed against the starlit sky, filled with their winter stores of hay and grain. They'd worked so hard to prepare for the cold months ahead. The quiet shattered with a cry from outside. Isabel's head snapped up. At Richard's shout, through the window she saw an orange glow flickering in the barn's windows. Her heart stopped. Fire. She ran outside, her skirts whipping in the wind. The barn door stood open, flames already climbing the walls inside. Richard's lantern lay abandoned by the entrance. Smoke billowed out as he rushed into the inferno. "Richard!" Isabel screamed. She could hear the terrified whinnying of horses within. Running to the well, she hauled up the bucket with trembling hands. Water sloshed over her boots as she raced toward the barn. Through the doorway, she glimpsed Richard fighting to free the horses from their stalls. The heat struck her face like a physical blow. Flames crawled across the hay-strewn floor, racing up the wooden walls. Isabel threw her bucket of water at the nearest flames, but it made little difference against the growing blaze. "The horses?" Richard shouted, his voice rough with smoke. He managed to free their draft horse, slapping its rump to drive it outside. Isabel saw angry red burns forming on his forearms as he struggled with the second stall's latch. She ran back to the well, muscles straining as she drew up another bucket. The fire roared louder, drowning out her desperate calls for help. Richard emerged from the smoke, coughing violently, leading their mare to safety. His shirt sleeves were singed, angry blisters already forming on his exposed skin. "Get back." He grabbed Isabel's arm as a support beam cracked overhead. They stumbled away from the building just as the roof began to cave. The sound was deafening, splintering wood and the crash of falling timbers. Sparks shot skyward like a fountain of stars. Isabel screamed again for help, her voice growing hoarse. In the distance, she heard shouts as neighbors finally noticed the blaze, but it was too late. The barn was fully engulfed, their winter stores burning away to ash. All their careful preparation gone in minutes. Richard swayed beside her, and Isabel caught him before he could fall. His face was streaked with soot, his breathing labored. The burns on his arms looked terrible in the firelight. Neighbors arrived with buckets and shovels, but there was nothing left to save. They could only work to keep the flames from spreading to the house. Hours later, Isabel sat beside Richard at their kitchen table, gently cleaning his burns by lamplight. Her hands shook as she applied cool cloths to the angry red skin. Tears streamed down her face, falling onto his wounded arms. "The grain?" she whispered brokenly. "The hay. All our supplies for winter." Richard's face was drawn with pain, but his voice remained steady. "Don't give up, Isabel." She looked at him through her tears, seeing the extent of his injuries in the lamp's glow. The burns would take weeks to heal properly. How could they rebuild with him wounded? How would they survive the winter with no stored feed for the livestock? No preserved goods in the barn? The weight of it all crashed over her. Isabel pressed her forehead against Richard's shoulder, her body shaking with sobs. Everything they'd worked for, everything they'd fought to protect, it felt like ashes in her mouth. The railroad's message was clear. They would stop at nothing to drive them from the land. "We can't," she choked out. "Without the barn. Without supplies, Richard, we can't survive the winter." His uninjured hand found hers, squeezing gently. Even through his obvious pain, he tried to comfort her. Isabel felt crushed beneath the magnitude of their loss. The barn had been more than just a building. It was their security, their preparation for the harsh months ahead. Now it was gone, and Richard was hurt, and she had never felt more helpless. She spent the rest of the night tending his burns, fighting back tears as she wrapped clean bandages around his arms. The scent of smoke still clung to everything, a bitter reminder of their devastation. Outside, the ruins of the barn smoldered under the cold stars, and Isabel's heart smoldered with it, a mixture of despair and helpless rage at those who had destroyed their lives so carelessly. Through his pain, Richard whispered again, "Don't give up, Isabel." But in the dark hours before dawn, as she watched him finally drift into an uneasy sleep, Isabel felt nothing but overwhelming despair. Their future, so recently bright with hope, now seemed as dark as the night around them. The morning after, the fire dawned cold and gray. Isabel's muscles ached as she stepped out into the bitter wind, her eyes burning from lack of sleep. The barn's blackened skeleton stood as a stark reminder of all they had lost. Richard's fever had worsened overnight. His burns, angry and weeping, despite her careful tending. She forced herself to walk the property, assessing the damage in daylight. The horses huddled miserably in the corner of the yard, their breath steaming in the chill air. They needed shelter before the weather turned worse. Isabel gathered fallen boards and posts from the barn ruins, dragging them one by one to create a crude lean-to against the house wall. Her hands blistered on the rough wood. But she couldn't stop by midday. She had managed to build a makeshift shelter. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep the worst of the wind off the animals. Her back screamed in protest as she forked what little salvageable hay remained into the crude structure. The horses nickered gratefully, pressing close to the wall for warmth. Inside the house, Richard tossed restlessly in their bed, his skin hot to the touch. Isabel pressed cool cloths to his forehead and changed his bandages, her heart clenching at his barely suppressed groans of pain. "Rest," she whispered, though she wasn't sure he could hear her through the fever's haze. The next 3 days passed. In an exhausting blur, Isabel worked from dawn until well past dusk, patching fences damaged by the fire's heat, salvaging what she could from the barn's remains, trying to create some semblance of order from the chaos. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a proper meal or slept. More than a few minutes between checking on Richard. On the fourth night, as she stumbled through her evening chores, her legs simply gave out. She sat hard in the dirt of the yard, too tired even to cry. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. Richard's fever showed no signs of breaking. Their supplies dwindled daily. Winter's icy fingers crept closer with each passing night. A terrible thought crept into her mind as she stared at the darkening sky. Her uncle's house was only a day's ride away. He would take her in, despite everything. Richard would have one. Less mouth to feed, one less burden to bear. Perhaps he would recover faster without her fumbling attempts at nursing. Perhaps. The thought of leaving tasted like ash in her mouth, but it haunted her as she dragged herself back inside. Richard lay still in their bed, his breathing shallow. She began the nightly ritual of changing his bandages, her movements mechanical. With exhaustion, then she heard it. His lips moved in quiet prayer, words barely audible in the lamp's dim light. Not for himself, not for relief from his pain. He prayed for her. "Lord, give Isabel strength," he whispered through cracked lips. "Grant her courage when mine fails. Keep her faith strong when the path seems dark." Isabel's hands stilled on the bandages. Tears, she thought, had long since dried up, welled in her eyes. This man, despite his fever and pain, was praying not for his own recovery, but for her spirit. The shame of her earlier thoughts about leaving crashed over her. Slowly, her knees bent. For the first time since her father's death, since this strange marriage began, since the fire destroyed their hopes, Isabel knelt in prayer. Her tears fell freely now as she whispered her own broken words to heaven. "Please," she breathed, "give me strength to be worthy of this man's faith. Help me find the courage he sees in me. Show me how to keep going when I think I cannot take another step." Something stirred in her chest, a warmth she had almost forgotten. The crushing weight of despair lifted just enough to let her breathe. Again. She remained kneeling beside the bed, one hand clasped in Richard's fevered one, until her tears subsided. When she finally rose, her legs still trembled with exhaustion, but her spirit felt steadier than it had in days. She would not run. She would not abandon this man who had shown her nothing but steadfast care, who prayed for her courage even in his darkest hour. Isabel touched Richard's forehead gently. His skin still burned with fever, but his face looked more peaceful than before. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm staying right here." She settled into the chair beside him, ready to maintain her vigil through another long night. The path ahead remained dark and uncertain, but she was no longer walking it alone. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to Isabel's recent dark days. She sat at the kitchen table, determination straightening her spine as she dipped her pen in ink, though her fingers trembled slightly from exhaustion. Her writing was steady and clear as she drafted letters to their neighbors. "We have need of help," she wrote plainly, setting aside her pride. "Our barn burned. Richard is injured, and winter approaches. Any aid would be most welcome." She signed each letter carefully, addressing them to both English and Amish families. In the surrounding area, Richard watched from his sick bed, his fever finally broken, but his strength still weak. "You need not humble yourself so," he murmured. Isabel sealed another envelope with steady hands. "There is no shame in asking for help from neighbors. You taught me that." Days passed slowly as they waited. Isabel continued her endless chores, checking the makeshift animal shelter, tending Richard's healing burns, and praying silently for response to her letters. On the fourth morning, she heard wagon wheels approaching. Her heart leaped as she stepped onto the porch. Not one wagon, but 3 rolled toward their farm, loaded with lumber and tools. More followed throughout the morning, English families in their colorful clothes, Amish in their plain, dark garments, all bringing what they could spare. "We came as soon as we got your letter," Martha Yoder said, helping unload baskets of food from her wagon. No one stands alone in times of trouble. Soon the yard bustled with activity. Men examined the barns. Remains calculating lumber needs. Women organized a makeshift outdoor kitchen to feed the workers. Children darted about, carrying tools and water. Isabel found herself handed a hammer and nails. She had never built anything before, but determination set her jaw as she climbed alongside others to help raise the frame. Her strikes were clumsy at first, but she learned quickly. Driven by the urgency of approaching winter, Richard sat in a chair near the construction, his bandaged arms still too tender for heavy work. But his quiet voice guided their efforts, explaining proper joints and bracing techniques. His eyes held deep gratitude as he watched the community labor together. Differences set aside for a common cause, the work continued for several days. Walls rose steadily, then roof beams. Isabel's muscles ached, but pride filled her chest each time she drove a nail true. She worked alongside English and Amish women alike, their shared purpose bridging any cultural gaps. Sometimes she caught Richard watching her, something warm in his gaze that made her cheeks flush. She was no longer the reluctant bride, but a true partner in their life together. Every board she helped raise felt like building their future. As evening fell on the final day, the new barn stood complete. It was smaller than the old one, but sturdy, built with care and community spirit. The last wagon departed, leaving blessed quiet behind. Isabel prepared a simple supper, movements slow with exhaustion, but contentment. Richard sat in his usual chair by the hearth, his burns healing. Well now, the firelight played across his familiar features as she brought him a bowl of stew. They ate in comfortable silence until Isabel set aside her empty bowl. Her heart felt as full as it had ever been, understanding at last flooding through her. When I said I do, she spoke softly, meeting Richard's eyes. I never knew what it meant. She reached across and took his hand, careful of his healing burns. But now I do with all my heart. Richard's fingers tightened gently around hers. No words were needed as they sat together in the firelight, the warmth between them having nothing to do with the flames. Isabel felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy. This marriage, begun in duty and desperation, had grown into something beautiful and true. Their new barn stood strong outside, built by many hands working as one. But the strongest thing built in these past days was the love between them. Forged in fire and hardship, tempered by community and faith. As Richard clasped her hand, Isabel knew at last that she was exactly where she belonged. The letter arrived on a crisp December morning, carried by a breathless messenger boy who had ridden hard from town. Isabel's hands shook as she unfolded. The official paper: the judge would deliver his final ruling tomorrow at 10 o'clock. What if she began, but Richard gently touched her shoulder. We have truth on our side, he said simply, his quiet confidence steadying her racing heart. They spent the evening preparing their best clothes and gathering the precious documents. One final time, Isabel carefully tied Anna's letters with a fresh ribbon, handling each page as tenderly as if they were made of spun glass. These yellowed papers held not just their legal salvation, but the story of a family's devotion to the land. Dawn found them already on the road, their wagon joining. A steady stream of others heading to town. Word had spread quickly, and it seemed the whole county had turned out to witness the verdict. Isabel's throat tightened at the sight of familiar faces, both English and Amish filling. The wagon yard outside the courthouse. We stand with you, Martha Yoder called out as they passed, and others nodded in agreement. The show of support brought tears to Isabel's eyes. Inside the cramped courtroom, railroad agent Marcus Gray sat with his lawyers, his usual smooth confidence showing signs of strain. The room hummed with whispered conversations until the judge entered, his face giving nothing away as he took his seat. In the matter of the railroad's claim versus Lapwater rights, the judge began, his voice cutting through the tension. I have reviewed all evidence thoroughly. Richard stood tall beside Isabel, his presence solid as an oak. When called forward, he presented Anna's letters with reverence, his voice clear and steady as he explained their significance. These show my family's careful stewardship of the water rights for 3 generations, he stated. My sister Anna documented every agreement, every improvement made to preserve the spring. One by one, neighbors came forward to testify. Old Samuel Miller described how the railroad had tried to pressure him into selling his land. Sarah Jenkins recounted threats made against her family's farm. Each story built upon the last, painting a clear picture of the railroad's ruthless tactics. Marcus Gray shifted uncomfortably in his seat as more witnesses spoke of suspicious accidents, mysterious fires, and unsigned documents that somehow appeared in official records. His lawyers shuffled papers nervously, their earlier arrogance melting away. The judge listened intently, his expression thoughtful as he examined Anna's letters. The careful handwriting spoke of years spent recording water levels, maintenance, work, and agreements with neighboring farms. It was a testament to the deep connection between the family and their land. Isabel held her breath as the judge finally set the papers down and cleared his throat. The room fell silent, every eye fixed. Upon him. The evidence presented clearly establishes the Lapp family's long-standing claim to these water rights, he declared. Furthermore, the pattern of intimidation demonstrated by the railroad's agents is deeply troubling. He paused, his gaze sweeping the courtroom before continuing. I hereby rule that all rights to the land and water in question belong legally and rightfully to Richard and Isabel Lapp. The railroad's claim is dismissed. For a moment, perfect stillness held the room. Then, joy erupted like a summer storm. Cheers rang out as neighbors embraced one another. Marcus Gray stormed from the courthouse, his face dark with fury, but no one paid him any mind. Isabel found herself wrapped in Martha Yoder's arms, happy tears flowing freely down both their faces. Richard stood quietly amid the celebration. But when Isabel looked up at him, his eyes shone with more emotion than she had ever seen. The ride home seemed to pass in a dream. The December sun hung low in the afternoon sky, painting the snow-dusted fields in shades of gold. Isabel leaned against Richard's shoulder, her heart so light she felt she might float away like a dandelion seed on the wind. It feels strange, she said softly. When my uncle first told me I had to marry you, I thought my whole world was ending. But now... Richard prompted gently when she fell silent. Isabel smiled, watching their shadows stretch long across the snow. Now I know it was just beginning. Richard's arm tightened around her waist, and in that simple gesture lay all the words of love and gratitude that neither of them needed to speak. The land was theirs, secured by truth and justice. But more precious still was the love that had grown between them as steady and life-giving as the spring they had fought to protect. The first snow of winter drifted down like gentle lace as neighbors gathered at the Lapp farm. The new barn stood proud against the darkening sky, its sturdy beams a testament to the community's united strength. Inside, warmth from the cook stove filled every corner of the house with the rich smell of fresh bread and stewed chicken. Isabel moved between guests, her heart full as she watched English and Amish families mingling freely. Martha Yoder demonstrated her pickle recipe to Sarah Jenkins, while old Samuel Miller traded farming wisdom with young Thomas Bedford. The simple supper she and Richard had prepared stretched to feed everyone, just as the loaves and fishes had multiplied in the Bible story. We are blessed beyond measure, Richard said quietly, appearing at her side. His eyes swept across the room, taking in the scene of fellowship. Someone started a hymn, and others joined in. The blended voices rose sweet and clear plain folk, singing in German, English folks in their own familiar words, yet somehow the music wove together perfectly. Isabel found herself humming along, remembering how strange and foreign these gatherings had once felt. Who would have thought, Martha whispered, squeezing Isabel's hand, that such good could come from such troubled beginnings. As evening deepened, the guests began to depart, each carrying leftover bread or pie as a token of thanks. The pantry and root cellar were well stocked now, filled with gifts of grain, preserved vegetables, and dried meat. In the new barn, 2 young heifers and a flock of chickens settled in for the night presents from neighbors who understood the cruel loss they had suffered. When the last wagon pulled away, Isabel stood in the doorway, watching snowflakes dance in the lamplight. Richard touched her elbow gently. "I have something for you," he said. From his pocket, he drew out a small wooden ring, carefully carved from a piece of oak. The surface was polished smooth, its simple beauty matching the quiet strength of their life together. "It is not gold," Richard said softly, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty she had never heard before, "but it is made with love." Isabel's vision blurred with tears as she held out her hand. The ring slipped perfectly onto her finger, as if it had always been meant to rest there. "It is more precious than gold," she whispered, and in the warm lamplight saw Richard's rare, full smile bloom like a flower turning toward the sun. The winter wind whistled against the window panes as Isabel and Richard sat in the warmth of their farmhouse. The fireplace cast dancing shadows across the wooden floors, its flames crackling softly in the evening quiet. Outside, snow blanketed the world in white, but inside, peace wrapped around them like a warm shawl. Isabel's needle moved steadily through the fabric of her quilt, each stitch a testament to their rebuilt life together. Her eyes drifted occasionally to Richard's arms, where pink scars from the barn fire were slowly fading to silver. He had suffered greatly to save their animals, but his strength had never wavered. Richard's deep voice filled the room as he read. From the family Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by generations of faithful hands. The familiar words of Psalms brought comfort, speaking of shelter in times of storm. Isabel's heart swelled with gratitude for how far they had come from strangers bound by necessity to partners joined in love. "The Lord is my shepherd," Richard read, his voice steady and sure. "I shall not want." Isabel's fingers paused in their work as she watched him. The lamplight caught the silver threading through his dark hair. And his face, once so stern to her eyes, now showed only gentle wisdom. Here was the man who had taught her to plow, who had defended her dignity, who had prayed through fever for her sake. Setting aside her quilting, Isabel rose to prepare for bed. She moved through their home, their true home, now touching familiar things with newfound appreciation. The kitchen where they shared quiet breakfasts, the hooks where their cloaks hung side by side, the windows where morning light streamed in to wake them. What had once felt like a prison now sheltered her deepest joys. Richard closed the Bible and followed her, his footsteps sure in the familiar space. Together, they knelt beside their bed, clasping hands in the way that had become their nightly custom. Isabel bowed her head, remembering how she had once resisted prayer, how foreign this plain life had seemed. Now peace flowed through her like a gentle stream. After their prayers, Richard extinguished the lamp. Darkness settled around them as they lay down to rest, their hands finding each other beneath the quilts. Outside, the winter wind howled fierce and cold, but Isabel felt only warmth and certainty. The marriage that had begun as chains had transformed into her greatest freedom, love chosen daily, strengthened by trial, anchored in faith. Richard's steady breathing beside her spoke of trust and devotion. Together, they had built something stronger than any storm could shake. Their future stretched bright before them, rich with promise, secure in love's shelter. Thanks for watching. Stories like this shape us in ways we don't always expect. If something resonated, subscribe. I'm back tomorrow with another one worth hearing.